Welcome to this mini workshop. Here's our basic guiding question. How do we hold the charge of this moment? The emotional, energetic charge, the weight, that just heaviness that so many of us are feeling. And what do we do with the disillusionment that comes with it? What do we do with the feelings of what do I do next? What can I do next? How do we metabolize the charge that's going through our bodies so that we can take our next steps in ways that feel good? That's what we'll be exploring today in this mini workshop, about 20 or 25 minutes or so. And a quick shameless plug, just kind of before we get going, all of this is pulled from a program that I've been building to support folks who are in the midst of disillusionment, helping them move from that space of disillusionment into localized relational action, which is just deeply, viscerally important right now. And so if any of this connects with you, I invite you to check out the program and consider joining when we open the doors in January. Let's start with just a little overview of how our nervous system works and what I mean when I say charge. So we each have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. When we experience conflict, crisis, trauma, discomfort, all of this gets activated. In fact, these systems are constantly working within us. So we're just going to go over both really quickly here as a place to ground. Our central nervous system, which is housed in our brain and in our spinal cord, it's kind of like our command center. It's sending, receiving, and interpreting messages between the brain and the rest of the body all the time. Touch something hot, sensation is going to shoot up to the central nervous system where it's going to get interpreted, and then the interpretation gets sent back down into the body to spring into action. That was hot. Move hand. Run water over the burn. Turn off the burner. Some of those actions are going to be voluntary, like moving your hand and running water over your hand. Some are going to be automatic, not voluntary. Your heart rate going up, blood pressure spiking, and sometimes in the right circumstances, even the hand movement itself is going to be a non-voluntary response. If it is a non-voluntary response, a non-voluntary action, it's actually going to be regulated by our peripheral nervous system, and more specifically, our autonomic nervous system. This system has two ways of operating: to speed up responses, which we call sympathetic responses, or to slow down our responses. We call this parasympathetic. And depending on the situation, it will send signals up to the central nervous system to let the brain know, are we leaning in or are we leaning back? This is where we get our fight, flight, freeze concept from. When we're in fight or flight, that's our sympathetic system saying, go, go, go. We got to charge. We got to do something here. This is panic. This is high stress anger. When we freeze or feel disconnected, our parasympathetic system is typically in operation. But that's the key to understand about our nervous system. It moves into action in some way, whatever way that is, to protect us based on the stimuli. So regardless, thinking about our central nervous system, our peripheral nervous system, thinking about the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response, all of it is working to protect us. Everything has a function. Everything is there for some sort of contextual reason. Our body is attempting to protect us or to let us know something. And related to this, charge. Charge always has context and comes from context. And what that means is that when we feel charge, it's always in the midst of everything else that's going on. It's how our nervous system is interpreting and responding to everything going on around us, that context. The charge itself also comes from context. And so it's not that you feel this certain way and it's a you thing. It's that it is the way we are interpreting and interacting with the world around us. And we've all been in conflict and crisis. We know what charge feels like, right? There's a texture and an energy. It's the weight we feel, the heaviness. For some of us, it's like a train that hits us and we're just completely done. And for others of it, it's like a dull ache that we can put up with for a really long time. And then for some, it's a fog that we're walking around in, and we're barely even aware that it exists, right? That's the role of awareness and bringing attention in the kind of practices we're going to talk about later is how do we become aware of the fog? So the charge of a moment and the charge of this particular moment that we're in, with all these intersecting crises, the charge is going to feel different to each of us based on how our nervous system is tempered and responding, based on what our central nervous system has as its toolkit, and, and based on how our peripheral nervous system, our sympathetic and parasympathetic responses, have been tempered to handle charge. Let's talk about crisis and this moment. And then I'll share a couple practices for holding the charge, moving the charge, and tempering our bodies. But first, I really want to contextualize we are in a moment of intersecting crises. That's why so many of us are carrying this weight, this heaviness, and it's not just us. Cornel West refers to this as a time of catastrophe, when we're impacted and feeling the charge of personal, collective, societal crises all at once, coming from all these different angles, all these different textures. So here's some of the crises we might be feeling. And as I go through them, I invite you maybe pause after each one and feel it in your body. What's the texture of the charge that you're feeling? What does it look like in your own life? Just to get a little bit of an understanding experientially of what each of these mean for you. So the first one is individual. This is the crisis of who am I? The crisis of meaning, the crisis of sense of self, sense of purpose, autonomy, uniqueness, value. These are the questions of me-ness, and they can be poked at just about anywhere, by any time, and even by ourselves, right? These moments where maybe our choice is taken away, our autonomy is stripped from us, where we feel like we don't have power, where the story we had been telling ourselves about ourselves and what our meaning and purpose is for the world isn't received by the world in the way that we needed it to be received. And it spins us into an individual crisis. Well, what now? And so we each have these individual crises at different points and with these different, that they take different shapes. There's also interpersonal crises. We all know these ones for sure. Intimate relationships, connections with others, the crises of sense of belonging. And these become a crisis specifically when there's a breakdown in relationship or a perceived breakdown, a conflict at work that's too much or too quick, or you don't have enough tools, you don't have enough resilience built to be able to hold the charge of that moment. Perhaps a feeling of betrayal around expectations and unmet expectations. So that's the interpersonal crises that we face either daily or pretty close, maybe weekly for some of us. We then have institutional crises that are happening. How we relate to and engage with institutions, with news and media and educational landscapes and religious traditions for many of us, how we relate to banking and the military and policing. These are all institutions. And these become a crisis when there's a loss of trust, when something breaks down, especially when it's a pattern of breaking and breakdown over time, the fracturing of our news and educational landscape, the shift from people first to profit first, companies that we have become dependent upon. Boeing is a phenomenal example of an institutional, or at least the manifestation of an institutional breakdown, right? It was a company that, especially in the 70s and 80s, was seen as very much engineer first. And it has slowly become this profit first company that lost a lot of trust with a lot of people. And it's a great example also because once the trust is gone, it gets faster and faster how quickly the trust continues to go. And then there's the intergenerational. These are the crises that we have inherited from previous generations, cultural norms, beliefs about right or wrong, who is in and out, what has value and what does not have value, systems for belonging and acceptance, systems and norms that have been allowed to linger either passively or actively. I think of white supremacy, misogyny, heteronormativity. And that brings us to the final one, the existential, the really big, in keeping with the eyes, I want to refer to it as the intergalactic. But it's the big, it's the cosmic, it's the existential, the question of why. Why is this happening? What is the point of all this? And so you can see all of these can be crisis level. And the intersection when we're dealing with, as a culture or a society or just a large group of people, a community perhaps, or just even a family unit, when we're sitting in the intersection, it isn't just a crisis, it's a catastrophe. When we're sitting at that intersection of all of these different types of crises, the weight, the texture, the charge isn't going to be just that of one of them. The charge is going to be exhausting at a much bigger scale. So if you feel exhausted right now, this is why. We're sitting at this intersection. And so an exercise you can do is pause this video. If you have a few minutes, I invite you to jot down for each of these intersections a crisis or conflict you're currently feeling. And it doesn't necessarily have to be all the ones you're aware of, but I really want to emphasize a crisis or conflict you're feeling. And just take a few moments to texture it for yourself. What are the feelings of this crisis? And take some time to become acclimated and aware of the texture of the charge, the quality of the charge, the subtleties of the charge that you're feeling, both of the individual crises, but also perhaps of all of them at once. So we're getting this charge blown through us from basically every direction, all of these different points of crisis, these intersecting crises. And when we're sitting in that intersection and we're feeling everything there is to feel, there's a question. Why does it feel different for me than the folks that I hang out with? Why does it feel different for me than the people I go to work with? Is it just me? And the truth is no. But we all have differently tempered bodies, different capacities for holding charge, different practices for discharging it, different practices for moving the charge through our bodies. The word I use for this is metabolizing, taking in the charge, feeling the charge, and metabolizing it through our bodies. But we all have differently tempered bodies. In other words, we have different windows of tolerance. So I'm going to walk you through this. This is a framework that I really appreciate. It gives an idea, gives an image for how this actually operates within us. And so imagine a window like this. And when we experience something that just spikes our sympathetic nervous system, I like to refer to this as blowing the top, right? Just like that volcano in the image, blowing the top. We go into this hyper aroused state. Anxiety spikes, anger, you feel out of control, overwhelmed, big, big, big. This is the fight or flight. It just kicks in and go, go, go. This isn't something you choose. It's just something that your body, right? The sympathetic part of our nervous system is not a choice. It's not in the central nervous system. It's a part of our involuntary autonomic nervous system. And so this is when everything spikes in you. You go into hyperarousal and you blow your top. On the other hand, there's the parasympathetic response, the freezing, the checking out, getting spacey, or wanting to shut down, to become your couch. That can also happen, and that's a hypoarousal. It's when your body starts to slow as a way of protecting. And I want to come back to that as a way of protecting, both of these as a way of protecting. Your window of tolerance is that middle part. It's the window. It's the width of how much we can take while still being centered, while still being choiceful and skillful in our response. And so trauma, people who have extensive trauma histories or just have some traumatic incidences and events in their histories, trauma tends to shrink our window, make it smaller. And so that it's easier, it's maybe quicker to jump into hyper arousal or hypo arousal. On the flip side, therapy and practices of resilience tend to widen our window, right? And this doesn't mean, even with the widest window in the world, this doesn't mean we don't respond to conflict, because tolerance isn't acceptance. Sometimes the word tolerance can be a little bit of a trip. Tolerance does not mean you're just putting up with shit. Tolerance means that our bodies can tolerate the charge so that we can respond in a centered way. And so when we're talking about how do we hold the charge of the all these crises in this moment, how are we opening our window little by little so that we can operate from a centered and grounded space? Cole Arthur Riley has this beautiful quote, and I won't try to say it verbatim, but she talks about not letting ourselves get chewed up from the inside by all the narratives and all the stuff, and instead sending the teeth where they are meant to go. I think that is the role, and the window of tolerance helps us here, of how do we expand our window so that we can intentionally and skillfully, choicefully experience the crises of our moment, and then send the teeth where they are meant to go in a grounded way, not in a reactive way. So what can this look like? The first thing I want to offer us is this can be an invitation for us to build a daily practice, build a rhythm of resilience. This is all about building capacity. What are you doing each day to just a little bit, just get that window a little bit more open, to temper our body to be able to handle and hold charge? Trauma specialist Resmaa Menakem refers to this as doing the reps. And he talks about 3 kinds of reps specifically. And I want to pause using that rep language. He's using it really intentionally because this is like building muscle in a gym, doing a repetition. Capacity takes time to build. And so widening the window takes time. Resmaa offers us 3 types of reps to do in our life to build this kind of resilience. The first, he refers to these as living reps. These are the ones that we're most familiar with. Life occurs, conflict occurs, and we have a chance to do a rep with it. This is the living reps are out in the world. An example, a coworker perhaps misgenders someone at work, and you're faced with the question of, do you say something or not? Do you wait for someone else to say something? Do you risk rocking the boat? That's an invitation into a life rep. Another example would be a friend comments that all political parties are the same, so voting doesn't matter. That's a choice and a chance to do a rep, a space where you can build that muscle, leaning in from a centered space, and do a rep and engage, or move away. Another example would be a war breaks out. Life is on the line. Do you educate and seek to understand and communicate with representatives and activists? That example of or that rep of leaning in. The thing about living reps is that they're constant and every day. They happen without our planning. And so one thing that you can do, even in the morning, knowing that at some point something's going to happen. You might not be able to plan for the exact rep, but you could say that if this thing happens, I'm going to do X. Which brings us into the second kind of rep. These are invited reps. These are the ones we choose. These are the ones we opt into, that bring us into attention and awareness, and that often goes unnoticed. So this is the, I'm going to be intentional about this. Here's an example. Choosing to have a hard conversation with someone, or choosing to journal and work with the 5 intersections to intentionally feel the charge a little bit so you can temper your body. An invited rep is something we often do instead of out in the world in the midst of everything. Oftentimes we'll do this in a safe space, or a safe enough space for us, where we will say, I'm going to take just a little bit of this charge. I'm going to feel a little bit right now so I can learn how it feels, so that when I feel it out in the world, I'll know what to do. My body will have some practice. And so this might look like visualizing a conflict you can foresee coming. Visualize it so that you can plan what to do. This could look like meditating every morning, right? Building that muscle, that daily practice of silence, calmness, centered, grounded nervous system. An example of this from my life is my partner and I had a very honest conversation a little while ago. We were in the car, and we asked the question, what are we prepared to do when violence escalates in our area? It was right before the election. And this was an invited rep for us. It was uncomfortable, it was uncertain, it was scary. We talked about our willingness to show up to protests with pepper spray milk for folks who need it. We talked about who we would leave the kids with. We basically created a plan. This is stuff we can do. These are things we will do. And we talked about things we weren't willing to do. And we talked openly about the discomfort of even having that kind of conversation. So that's an invited rep because we opt into it. An exercise for you is to maybe think about 5 minutes a day. What is an invited rep you can do that will hold or just invite a little bit of that charge of a crisis into your life so that you can texture it and start training your body in how to stay within your window of tolerance with it. And the final is a primal rep. These are primal, visceral, animal ways that we metabolize charge in our body. So just some concrete examples. Self-touch. When you're stressed and you're in the midst of conflict, doing a little self-touch in whatever way that feels good. Humming, swaying, crying, releasing the shoulders, the muscle tension that's happening, extending our jaws. One of my favorite is if I'm in the midst of a lot of conflict, I'll practice softening my face muscles. I tell myself, see with soft eyes. I look somewhere in the distance and I just practice releasing and seeing with soft eyes. What this is doing is these are training our body, tempering our body so that we can learn the very physical, the physicality of having a centered or grounded nervous system. Once again, not so that we can just survive situations, but so that we can respond to them with intentionality and not just going on autopilot. Another core aspect of tempering our bodies, along with daily practice, is centering ourselves within community. No matter how big, no matter how small, community is often used as a big buzzword, but this really is an invitation. When we are in the midst of so many intersecting crises, community is key for each of us to have in whatever form it takes. And so something you can do is contextualize yourself within a space that's openly talking about the charge, or that can openly talk about the charge. And if you don't currently have the space, find it, create it. If you have a white body, look up the local surge group in your area, showing up for racial justice group. Look up one of your local activist organizations, your local mutual aid network, right? The easiest thing, or perhaps the hardest thing for some of us, is invite who you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, a brother, a sibling, a parent. Invite them over and just talk about what you're feeling. Ask others how they're feeling it. And then within this context of community, I really invite you, this is either going to go over well or poorly. I'm going to really invite you to avoid reading books. Often reading books together distracts us from the charge that we're feeling. And it kind of feels like we're doing something. But if you need to read a book in order to feel educated enough, that's great. But really the invitation is to shift out of your cognitive way of wrestling with crises and into an embodied way of seeing a crisis, of feeling the charge of a crisis and tempering the body to be able to hold it. So instead of starting a book club, perhaps, I invite you to get into a group and name the context and the fears and the feelings and the charge. You might do something called community asset mapping, centering the gifts and strengths that can be leveraged within your community, building a rhythm of engagement. With a group, you get active in small ways that can feel sustainable and relevant. The short version of this is get busy doing something, even if it's small. Once again, it's like a rep, building that muscle of engagement. So I want to give an example of community asset mapping and what that means. This is a community asset map. You can do this with your people. You can do this on your own. There's so many ways to do this. But basically, you identify your community. Who are the people in your community? And you, for each of these 5 categories, you just mind map who's there, what assets are there. And so an example would be maybe my community is my workplace. All right, who are the individuals in my workplace? The associations, what are the relational connections we have? Connections with each other, connections with industries, connection with other people who might have role or rank or power. What are the institutions that are connected to this community? What are the physical assets? Do people here own houses, homes, buildings, businesses? What's the stuff that this community might have access to because of our role together? And then cultural assets, lineage, cultural histories, language, traditions, rituals, ways of coming together. So this is community asset mapping. The next step of it would really be to have a conversation. And I would recommend have a conversation and do this with your community. And at the end of it, you've got this big, beautiful asset map thinking about what can we leverage to create change. It doesn't have to be big. Little, small, daily moments, gentle activism. But what are the ways that we can handle, metabolize, feel the charge, and discharge it in productive ways in the midst of crisis that then have a role of bringing healing and cultivating healing in the midst of that crisis? If you want support with any of this or more focused guidance, community, accountability, training when it comes to any of this, I'd love to see you inside the program I've been building. Our doors are going to open in January. If you're interested, please check it out. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well enough, and I hope this helps. Reach out anytime.